There is a bridge in Normandy that most people have never heard of. It is not the famous bridge at Remagen. It is not Arnhem, and it does not appear in the usual stories of D-Day as the kind of battlefield landmark that gets monuments, museums, and Hollywood films built around it. It was just a small bridge, crossing a narrow stretch of water beside a quiet town called Bénouville. But on the morning of June 6, 1944, that bridge became one of the most important pieces of ground in all of Europe. Because whoever controlled it controlled the road to the beaches, and the Germans were coming. Across Normandy, Allied soldiers were fighting their way inland. Thousands had landed under darkness and artillery fire. They were exhausted, disorganized, separated from their units. Some had landed miles from where they were supposed to be. Equipment was scattered across the beaches. Communications were breaking down, and the German defenders were beginning to understand what was happening. For the Allies, these first few hours were the most dangerous moment of the entire invasion, because there was one thing the Germans could still do: counterattack. If German armored divisions could move quickly enough, they could concentrate their tanks against the fragile Allied beachheads before those beachheads became strong enough to defend themselves. The German plan was brutally simple: reach the beaches, hit the Allied forces before they could reorganize, push them back into the sea. And if that happened quickly enough, D-Day could become one of the greatest military disasters in history. But there was a problem. To reach the invasion beaches, German forces needed to cross the bridges and roads around the Orne River. And one of the most important of those crossings was sitting almost completely undefended, or so the Germans thought. Just after midnight, while most of Normandy was still sleeping, British gliders came silently across the French countryside. Inside them were 181 men. No tanks, no heavy artillery, no massive armored force. Just soldiers carrying rifles, Sten guns, light mortars, and orders they had spent 18 months preparing to execute. Their mission was terrifyingly precise: land in darkness, seize the bridges, destroy the German defenses, and hold them until the main invasion force arrived. At 0016, the first gliders came down. They crashed into the darkness only yards from their objective. The soldiers climbed out. There was no dramatic warning, no long bombardment, no second chance. They had only minutes to take the bridges before the Germans realized what was happening. And then, the first shots were fired. In a matter of minutes, the men of D Company, 2nd Battalion, Oxford and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry captured the bridges. One of those bridges would soon become known to the world as Pegasus Bridge. But capturing it was only the beginning, because the real battle was not about taking the bridge. It was about holding it for hours against German counterattacks with almost no heavy weapons and with the entire Allied invasion force depending on them. The men defending Pegasus Bridge did not know it yet, but their tiny position had become a barrier between the German armored forces and the beaches of Normandy. Every minute they held that bridge bought the Allies more time, more soldiers, more tanks, more artillery, more supplies, and, more importantly, a chance to turn the invasion into a permanent foothold. The Germans would eventually realize what had happened, but by then it was already too late. The bridge had fallen, the route to the beaches had been blocked, and before the sun had fully risen over Normandy, 181 men had helped protect the future of the Allied invasion. This is the story of Pegasus Bridge, the silent airborne assault that helped save D-Day.
To understand why two small bridges in the French countryside became so important, we have to go back to Berlin. Spring 1944. The German High Command knew the Allies were coming, The question was not if they would invade France, it was where and when. For months, German commanders had studied maps, intercepted reports, and analyzed every possible Allied landing site. But behind those maps was a much bigger problem. The Germans could not agree on how to stop the invasion, and that disagreement would become one of the most expensive mistakes of the war. On one side stood Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Rommel had seen what Allied air power could do. He understood that once thousands of Allied soldiers established a secure beachhead, Germany's military position would become almost impossible to reverse. The Allies had overwhelming air power, a massive navy, and an industrial machine capable of replacing men, tanks, aircraft, and ammunition on a scale Germany could no longer match. Rommel's conclusion was simple. Stop the invasion on the beach. Do not wait. Do not allow the Allies to build strength. Hit them immediately while they were still vulnerable. Rommel believed the first 24 hours would decide everything. The invasion would either succeed or fail. As he famously described it, the first day would be the longest day. For Rommel, that meant one thing. The panzer divisions had to be close enough to attack immediately. But another powerful group of German commanders saw the situation differently. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in the West, and armored commanders such as Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg believed Rommel's strategy was too dangerous. Putting tanks near the coastline, they argued, would simply make them targets. Allied battleships could bombard them. Allied aircraft could hunt them from the sky. Instead, they wanted to keep the main panzer forces farther inland. Let the Allies land. Let them reveal the direction of their main attack. Then, bring the armor together and smash the invasion in one enormous counterattack. On paper, it was a powerful strategy, but there was one problem: Hitler. The final arrangement became a dangerous compromise. Some German armored divisions remained close enough to respond quickly, but many of the most powerful panzer reserves were held farther inland, and several of them could not simply move when their commanders believed the moment had arrived. They required authorization from Hitler himself. That meant that when the invasion finally came, German commanders would not have complete freedom to act. Every minute of hesitation mattered. And on the eastern flank of the Allied invasion zone, there was another problem, a geographical one. The road towards the British landing beaches near Sword, Juno, and Gold passed through a narrow bottleneck near the town of Bénouville. There were two bridges. One crossed the Caen Canal, the other crossed the Orne River. They stood only a few hundred meters apart, small structures but strategically enormous. Because if German tanks wanted to move towards the coast from the east, these bridges were among the critical routes they could use. And the Germans knew exactly how important they were, so they prepared them for destruction. Heavy demolition charges were attached to the bridges, electrical detonators were installed, control positions were established nearby. The plan was brutally simple. If the Allies approached, the Germans would press the switches, the bridges would disappear into the water, and the route for any advancing Allied or German force would be broken. From the German perspective, everything made sense. They expected the invasion to come from one direction, the sea. They expected Allied troops to fight their way inland. They expected to have enough warning to destroy the bridges before the enemy could reach them. What they did not expect was an enemy falling from the sky. No battleships, no tank columns, no massive artillery barrage. Instead, in the darkness before dawn, British gliders were already approaching Bénouville, and inside them were soldiers who knew exactly what those bridges meant.
The Germans had prepared the bridges for an attack. They had prepared explosives. They had prepared defenses. They had prepared for everything except the possibility that the first Allied soldiers would land almost directly beside their objective. And that was the fatal flaw. The Germans were waiting for the invasion to come from the sea. The men of the Oxford and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry were coming from the sky, and they were only minutes away. By 1944, the men of D Company knew the target so well that they could move through the assault course almost automatically. But training was only half the problem. Howard also needed to know exactly what waited for them in Normandy, and that information came from the French resistance. Local civilians quietly watched the German positions. They studied guard routines. They recorded defensive positions. They identified roads and obstacles. They gathered every scrap of information they could without attracting German attention. That intelligence was then carried back to Britain. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. The British planners even constructed detailed sand table models of the target area. Glider pilots studied them. They memorized landmarks, trees, roads, buildings, telegraph lines, anything that could help them navigate through the darkness. Because there was another terrifying problem. The assault force would not arrive in tanks. It would not arrive in armored vehicles. It would come in wooden gliders. 6 Horsa gliders would carry the men across the English Channel. They would be towed behind aircraft, released over Normandy, and then glide silently toward the target. No engines, no second attempt, no way to turn around. Once released, the pilots were committed. And the men inside those gliders knew exactly what that meant. A single navigation error could put them hundreds of yards away. A sudden gust of wind could destroy a glider. A bad landing could kill the entire assault team before the first shot was fired. And even if they landed perfectly, they still had only minutes. The Germans had prepared demolition charges beneath the bridges. If the sentries realized what was happening, they could reach the detonators, and once those switches were activated, the bridges would be gone. That meant the assault had been reduced to a terrifying calculation. 18 months of training for roughly 2 minutes of execution. The soldiers would have to land, get out, find the bridges, storm the German positions, neutralize the guards, secure the demolition equipment, and do it all before the enemy could react. There was almost no margin for error. But by the night of June 5, 1944, the training was over. The models were packed away. The maps had been memorized. The orders had been issued. And the men of D Company climbed aboard their gliders. Outside, England was disappearing into darkness. Ahead of them was the English Channel. Beyond it, occupied France. And somewhere in the darkness below, 2 bridges were waiting. The men had spent 18 months preparing for this moment. Now they had only 2 minutes to prove that preparation had been enough. Then the tow ropes would be cut, and they would be on their own. Shortly before 11 o'clock on the night of June 5, 1944, 6 Halifax bombers lifted into the darkness from an airfield in Dorset. Behind each aircraft was a massive wooden Horsa glider. Inside those gliders were the men of D Company. They sat shoulder to shoulder in cramped, unheated cabins, surrounded by weapons, ammunition, equipment, and darkness. There were no windows to admire the view, no comfortable seats, no engine noise from their own aircraft, only the thunder of the Halifax engines ahead of them, and the constant groaning of the wooden gliders as they fought against the turbulent air above the English Channel. Nobody knew exactly what waited for them in Normandy, but every man knew what he had been trained to do. Then, at approximately 6,000 feet above the French coast, the tow ropes were released, and suddenly, the engines disappeared, The roar of the bombers faded into the distance. Silence swallowed the gliders. For the first time, the men were completely on their own. There was no engine to save them. No pilot could turn around. No second attempt. They were simply enormous wooden aircraft sliding through the darkness toward a target they could barely see. At the controls of the lead glider was Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork. His passenger was Major John Howard and the core of the assault force. Walwork had spent months studying the target. He knew the terrain. He knew the river. He knew the fields. He knew the hedgerows. He had studied the sand table models until the landscape of Normandy was almost burned into his memory. Now he had to find the bridge in complete darkness. Below him, Normandy was disappearing beneath clouds and ground fog. Walwork descended, lower, lower, until the darkness below began to take shape. Fields, hedges, trees. Somewhere ahead was the canal, and beyond it, the bridge. At approximately 0016 on June 6th, Walwork committed to the landing. The glider dropped through the darkness. Then, crash. The Horsa slammed into the ground. Its wooden undercarriage tore apart. The aircraft ripped through barbed wire and skidded violently across the wet earth at tremendous speed. Wood splintered. Metal screamed. Equipment flew through the cabin. The cockpit disintegrated. Walwork and his co-pilot were thrown forward through the shattered nose of the glider. And then, silence. For several seconds, nobody moved. The men inside the wreckage were stunned, bruised, disoriented, but alive. Major Howard slowly pulled himself upright. He looked around at the shattered glider. Then he looked through the enormous hole where the cockpit had been. And there it was, the bridge. Only moments earlier, it had been a target on a map. Now it was directly in front of him. Walwork had done something extraordinary. The glider had landed incredibly close to the objective, close enough that the assault force could reach the bridge almost immediately. And the Germans still had no idea what had happened. On the bridge, a young German sentry heard the crash. He froze. For a moment, he could not see anything through the darkness. Then, he made an assumption. An Allied aircraft had crashed nearby. That was not unusual. Allied bombers had been filling the skies over France for months. So the sentry waited. He expected flames, perhaps a flare, perhaps another explosion. But none came. And that hesitation lasted only a few seconds. Because while the German sentry was trying to understand the noise, the British soldiers were already moving. Men poured out of the shattered glider. Weapons were grabbed. Sten guns were raised. Grenades were ready. The soldiers sprinted through the darkness toward the bridge. There was no artillery barrage announcing their arrival. No aircraft screaming overhead. No tank column approaching from the horizon. Only boots pounding across the wet ground and the sound of men running towards the most important objective of their lives. The Germans still did not understand what was happening. And then, the first British soldier reached the bridge. The surprise was complete. For 18 months, D Company had trained for this exact moment. Now the training was over. There was no rehearsal left, no model, no instructor, no second chance. Only the bridge, the demolition charges, and the 2 minutes they had been preparing for. The battle for Pegasus Bridge had begun. The assault lasted only minutes, but those minutes would become part of military history. Before the German sentries could understand what was happening, British airborne troops were already charging across the bridge. At the front was Lieutenant Den Brotherich, only 22 years old. He led his men forward at full speed. There was no time to stop, no time to take cover. The Germans were beginning to react. Brotherich pulled the pin from a grenade and threw it directly into a German machine gun position. Boom! The position was hit, but the Germans were not finished. Gunfire erupted from the opposite side of the canal. Tracer rounds tore through the darkness. The British soldiers kept moving. Then a burst of German machine pistol fire struck Brotherich in the neck. He collapsed onto the bridge. His men ran past him. The assault could not stop. Brotherich would die only minutes later. He became the first Allied soldier killed by enemy action on D-Day. And there was something he did not know. Back in England, his wife was pregnant with their unborn child. Brotherich would never see his son, but the men he had led continued forward. They had reached the bridge. Now they had to take it. British soldiers stormed the German positions. Sten guns erupted at close range. Grenades exploded inside trenches and bunkers. The darkness over the canal was suddenly filled with gunfire. German defenders scrambled for their weapons. Some attempted to reach the demolition controls. Others fired from the opposite bank. But the British attack had come too quickly. The German garrison had barely understood that an attack was underway before its defenses were already being overrun. And beneath the chaos, another group of British soldiers was fighting a completely different battle. Engineers. Their mission was just as important as the assault itself. Find the explosives, find the wires, and make sure the bridges could not be destroyed. They moved beneath the bridge structure in the darkness, searching for the German demolition system. Their hands felt along the cables. They followed the wiring. Every second mattered, because somewhere nearby was the equipment that could turn the bridge into a pile of twisted steel. Then they found it, the demolition wires. The engineers immediately began cutting the connections. And then came an extraordinary discovery. The explosives had been prepared, the wiring was in place, but the German officer responsible for operating the electrical detonator had fled during the confusion. He had never activated it. The bridges were still standing, and the British had seized them intact. Only minutes after the first glider crashed into Normandy, both critical crossings were in British hands. The first objective was complete. But there was no time to celebrate, because Howard knew what was coming next. The Germans would eventually realize that the bridges had been captured, and when they did, they would come. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, Howard's wireless operator sent a message back to headquarters. It was short, simple, and deliberately ordinary. Ham and jam. The code meant one thing. Both bridges had been captured, intact. The eastern gateway to the Allied invasion zone was now controlled by British airborne troops. But as the gunfire faded and the darkness returned to the canal, Howard looked at the men around him. They had fewer than 200 soldiers. They had light infantry weapons, limited ammunition, and almost no heavy support. Some of their men were already wounded. Their commander had been killed. And somewhere beyond the darkness, German forces were beginning to move. The bridges had been captured, but capturing them was only the first half of the mission. Now came the part that would determine whether their sacrifice meant anything. They had to hold against German infantry, against artillery, and eventually against tanks. Because the Germans were about to discover that 2 small bridges near Bénouville were no longer theirs, and they were not going to surrender them easily. While Major Howard's men dug in around the bridges, another battle was already underway. But this one was not being fought with rifles. It was being fought with telephones, radio messages, orders, and time. Across Normandy, the German command structure was beginning to break apart. Reports of Allied airborne landings flooded headquarters, but the reports were confused, conflicting, incomplete. Nobody knew exactly how large the airborne assault was, or where the main attacks were taking place. Near Bénouville, a German reserve commander rushed to the canal to investigate reports of British paratroopers. He never made it. His staff car ran directly into a British roadblock. He was killed, and with him disappeared something the Germans desperately needed: first-hand information. The news continued moving up the chain of command, but slowly, and every minute mattered. Then came an even greater problem. The commander of the German 7th Army, General Friedrich Dollmann, was not even in Normandy. He was inland at Rennes. And what was he doing there? Taking part in a military exercise, a war game designed to simulate an Allied invasion of France. The irony was almost unbelievable. German officers were practicing how they would respond to an Allied amphibious assault, while the real invasion was already happening. Dollmann's staff spent precious hours trying to contact him. Telephone lines were overloaded. Communications were unreliable. Messages had to travel through layers of command. And while the German headquarters struggled to understand what was happening, British soldiers were already holding the bridges at Bénouville. Then the Germans faced another problem. Their most famous field commander was not there either: Erwin Rommel. Rommel had returned to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. He believed the weather made an immediate Allied invasion unlikely. The English Channel was rough, the skies were poor, the conditions looked terrible for a massive amphibious assault, but the Allies had already come, thousands of them, and they were pouring onto the beaches. Now the Germans needed their tanks, especially the 21st Panzer Division. It was one of the most powerful armored formations near Caen, and it was close enough to threaten the Allied landing zones. If the division could move quickly, it could potentially strike the British forces before they had time to consolidate. But the division was not ready to unleash its full strength. Its commander, General Edgar Fotchinger, was away from his headquarters during the critical opening hours. And even more importantly, the German command system had tied the hands of its own commanders. The main panzer reserves could not simply move whenever local commanders believed they were needed. They required authorization from the highest level, from Hitler himself. And Hitler was asleep at his mountain retreat in Bavaria. His staff knew that waking him was a serious matter, so they waited. The invasion was happening. The Allied beachheads were growing. British and American airborne troops were securing key positions, and the German armored forces that could potentially respond were sitting still. Minutes became hours. Hours became an opportunity, and the opportunity was disappearing. Eventually, orders began moving through the German command structure. The 21st Panzer Division was finally ordered toward the coast. But by then, the situation had changed. The Allies were no longer a few scattered landing parties struggling to survive. They were building an army. Every passing hour brought more soldiers onto the beaches, more tanks, more artillery, more ammunition, more aircraft. The German counterattack had needed to happen immediately. Instead, it was delayed by confusion, by missing commanders, by broken communications, by rigid orders, and by a command system that demanded permission at exactly the moment when initiative mattered most. The Germans had armored forces. They had trained soldiers. They had weapons capable of inflicting enormous damage. What they lacked was time. And time was exactly what the men at Pegasus Bridge had bought them. Howard's soldiers had not defeated the German army, not yet. but they had helped create something far more important: delay. Every hour the bridges remained in Allied hands was another hour the Germans could not use them as a route toward the beaches. Every hour the Allied beachheads survived was another hour for reinforcements to arrive. And slowly, the window in which Germany could still throw the Allies back into the sea began to close. The German command had not been destroyed. It had not been defeated in one dramatic battle. It had simply failed to react fast enough. The door to Normandy had been kicked open, and while the Germans were still searching for the key, the Allies were already marching through it. By dawn, the men at Pegasus Bridge could finally see what they were defending, and what they saw was terrifying. Fields stretched across the Normandy countryside. Roads disappeared into orchards and hedgerows. Beyond them lay the German positions, and somewhere out there, German reinforcements were moving toward them. Major John Howard had fewer than 200 men. They had rifles, Sten guns, Brand light machine guns, a few mortars, and several Piat anti-tank weapons. That was it. No tanks, no artillery battery, no protective wall of infantry stretching for miles. Just a small group of exhausted airborne soldiers holding two bridges that the German army desperately needed. Then, in the gray light of early morning, they heard engines. A German convoy was approaching Bénouville. The first vehicles appeared on the road. Trucks, infantry, men who apparently had no idea the bridges had already been captured. The lead vehicle continued forward, closer, closer. And then, the British opened fire. Machine guns erupted from the defensive positions. Rifles cracked across the fields. The German convoy slammed to a halt. Soldiers jumped from the trucks and desperately searched for cover, but they were caught in a carefully prepared crossfire. The Germans tried to organize themselves. They couldn't. Another group attempted to approach from a different direction. It was stopped. Then another attack came along the opposite bank. It failed as well. For the first time, the Germans began to understand that something was seriously wrong. The bridges were not lightly guarded. Someone had prepared a defense, and the British were not giving them a way through. But the real test was still coming. As the morning progressed, the sound of heavier vehicles began approaching from the distance. The Germans were bringing armor. Howard's men knew exactly what that meant. Their rifles were almost useless against a tank. Their light machine guns could do little more than suppress the infantry around it. They needed the Piat, a crude, heavy, and notoriously difficult anti-tank weapon. One of the men carrying it was Corporal Bill Gray. Gray had never fired the weapon in combat. Now, he was about to use it against an armored vehicle moving directly toward his position. He crouched inside a shallow ditch. The vehicle came closer. He waited. The engine grew louder. The tracks began to shake the ground beneath him. Closer, closer. Gray waited until the target was almost on top of him. Then he fired. Thud. The projectile slammed into the vehicle. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. Then the vehicle erupted in flames. It became a burning obstacle in the middle of the road. The German infantry behind it suddenly had nowhere to go. Their armored spearhead had been destroyed, and without it, the attack stalled. The German soldiers withdrew toward the orchards. But something even more important had happened. The Germans were beginning to misjudge the size of the force defending the bridges. From their reports, the position appeared far too strong to be held by a few hundred airborne soldiers. There had to be more, perhaps hundreds, perhaps 1,000,
perhaps even tanks somewhere behind the defensive line. The truth was very different. Howard's force was tiny, exhausted, and increasingly short of ammunition. But the Germans didn't know that. And on a battlefield, perception can be almost as powerful as firepower. Every machine gun burst made the defenders seem stronger. Every failed attack made the position seem larger. Every hour that the bridges remained in British hands convinced German commanders that they were facing a much greater force than actually existed. The illusion worked. Instead of breaking through immediately, German forces hesitated. They reorganized. They waited for reinforcements. They searched for another route. And while they were doing it, the clock kept moving. Down on the Normandy beaches, thousands upon thousands of Allied soldiers were coming ashore. Landing craft were unloading tanks. Engineers were clearing obstacles. Artillery was being brought inland. The Allied beachhead was growing stronger by the hour, and the men at Pegasus Bridge were buying that army something priceless: time. They were not expected to defeat the German army. They only needed to stop it long enough for the invasion force to establish itself, long enough for reinforcements to arrive, long enough for Normandy to become impossible to take back. But Howard's men were still isolated. They were still surrounded, and the Germans were not finished. The morning attacks had failed. The armor had been stopped. But now the German commanders knew exactly where the British were, and they were preparing to bring everything they could against the bridges. The next attack would be bigger, and this time the Germans would come prepared.
By midday on June 6th, the men at Pegasus Bridge had been fighting for nearly 12 hours. They were exhausted. Their ammunition was running low. German mortars continued to pound their positions, and all around them, Normandy was exploding into war. From the English Channel came the distant thunder of Allied naval guns. The beaches were still under fire. The invasion was still in its most dangerous hours, but the men of D Company were still holding the bridges. Then, through the distant sound of artillery, another sound began to emerge, something completely unexpected: bagpipes. The unmistakable sound of Scottish bagpipes drifting across the Normandy countryside. The men looked toward the road, and there, moving toward them, came the relief force. At the head of the column was Brigadier Lord Lovett, commander of the 1st Special Service Brigade, and walking beside him was his personal piper, Bill Millen. Millen had been ordered to play as the commandos advanced, so he did. With German positions still nearby, with artillery exploding in the distance, he walked forward playing his bagpipes. The tune was Blue Bonnets Over the Border. It was an almost surreal sight. Men who had spent the entire morning fighting for their lives watched as a lone piper calmly marched toward them through a battlefield. Lovett had made Howard a promise before D-Day. His commandos would reach the bridges at noon, and now they had arrived. Lovett walked up to Major John Howard. He checked his pocket watch, then casually apologized. He was late by exactly 2 minutes and 30 seconds. For the men who had been fighting since shortly after midnight, those 2 minutes meant almost nothing. The relief had arrived. The bridges were secure, and the eastern flank of the invasion was no longer hanging by a thread. What had begun with 6 gliders and 181 men in the darkness had succeeded. But the significance of Pegasus Bridge went far beyond the bridge itself. The Allied invasion depended on speed. The Germans needed time to organize their counterattack, and every obstacle standing between the German armor and the beaches mattered. If the bridges had been destroyed, or if the Germans had retained control of them, the roads towards Sword Beach could have become far more dangerous. German forces would have had another critical route toward the Allied flank. Instead, the bridges remained in British hands. The German response had been delayed. The Allied beachhead continued to grow. More soldiers came ashore. More tanks rolled inland. More artillery was established. And with every passing hour, the possibility of throwing the Allies back into the sea became smaller. That is what made Pegasus Bridge so important. It was not the largest battle of D-Day, it was not the bloodiest, and it certainly did not involve the largest army, but it demonstrated something fundamental about warfare. Sometimes a battle of an enormous scale can depend on a tiny piece of ground, a bridge, a road, a few minutes, and a handful of people willing to stand their ground. Today, the bridge and the surrounding battlefield are preserved as part of the memory of D-Day. The name Pegasus Bridge comes from the winged horse insignia worn by Britain's airborne forces, a fitting name for a bridge captured by men who had literally fallen from the sky. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of the story. History is often remembered through enormous armies, famous generals, and sweeping movements across maps. But sometimes history turns on something much smaller. A few hundred soldiers, a carefully rehearsed plan, a bridge in the darkness, and the courage to move forward when there was no guarantee of survival. On the night of June 5, 1944, 181 men crossed the English Channel in silent wooden gliders. They landed in darkness. They seized 2 bridges. They fought off German attacks, and they held their position until the invasion force could reach them. They had been given 18 months to prepare, and when the moment finally came, they had only minutes to get it right. They did, and those minutes helped open the door to Normandy. Pegasus Bridge had held, and so had D-Day. If you want more stories like this, stories hidden behind the famous battles, stories of the men and moments that changed the course of history, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments, which forgotten story of World War II should we uncover next? Because history is full of stories like Pegasus Bridge. Some are famous, others are almost forgotten. But sometimes the smallest stories carry the biggest consequences. Thank you for watching.